Leave this house immediately before I contact authorities. Richard Thornton's voice echoed through the marble hallway of his mother. Boston mansion as he gestured aggressively toward the frail 78-year-old woman, her oxygen equipment rolling beside her. You're terminally ill anyway, so why don't you receive care somewhere that isn't depleting my resources? What Richard didn't know, what this calculating hedge fund manager was too, busy planning inheritance numbers to notice, was that his mother, Eleanor, had already modified her estate documents 3 days earlier, designating her entire $83 million fortune to Maria Santos, the Filipino nurse who'd cared for her with genuine compassion while Richard counted days until she passed. And what Richard definitely didn't know was that Uncle Sam, had been working overnight security at that Beacon Hill estate for 6 months, documenting every moment of his troubling behavior while Maria secretly recorded evidence that would completely change his inheritance expectations forever. You see, I'd watched this whole situation unfold from the beginning, when Eleanor Thornton was first diagnosed with advanced cancer, and her only son Richard saw financial opportunities instead of his struggling mother. And what ID learned about the contrast between Richard's calculated distance and Maria's genuine compassion was going to expose some difficult truths about what family really means when money and inheritance are involved. Bro, before I tell you how this son's selfishness backfired so completely that he lost everything to the immigrant nurse he'd spent months trying to terminate, let me ask you something that might resonate. Have you ever watched adult children treat their aging parents like inconveniences instead of human beings? Especially when there's inheritance money involved? Drop your city in the comments and tell me about situations you've witnessed when someone was seriously ill and their kids were already planning the estate distribution. Because what happened in that Boston mansion is gonna show you exactly what happens when cruelty meets consequences and genuine love matters more than blood relations, you know? Now, if you'll pardon an old man for taking a moment here to collect myself, stories about children abandoning their struggling parents always affect me deeply. At my age, having watched too many families torn apart by inheritance conflicts, I've learned that the people who care for you at the end often deserve more than the people who share your DNA. Thank you for staying with Uncle Sam as I tell you about one of the most satisfying cases of justice I ever witnessed. To understand how Eleanor Thornton ended up leaving her massive fortune to her nurse son, we gotta go back about 18 months to when this whole situation started developing. Eleanor had been one of Boston's prominent society figures, old money going back 4 generations. Her family fortune built on shipping and banking in the 1800s. The kind of wealth that came with social obligations and philanthropic expectations that define upper-class New England culture. Eleanor's marriage to Robert Thornton in 1968 had united two prominent Boston families, creating a financial legacy that owned significant real estate throughout New England, held major stakes in several Fortune 500 companies, and moved in circles where charity events and symphony board meetings defined your social calendar. They'd had one child, Richard, born in 1975, who had been raised with every advantage that generational wealth could provide. But having every advantage doesn't automatically create good character. And Richard had grown into exactly the kind of entitled, selfish adult that you'd expect from someone who'd never struggled for anything. He'd attended Harvard because his grandfather's name was on a building, worked at prestigious investment firms where family connections mattered more than competence, and eventually started his own hedge fund that managed money for other wealthy people who also inherited their way into the upper class. Richard's relationship with his mother had always been transactional rather than affectionate. He contacted her when he needed something: money, connections, social introductions, and ignored her the rest of the time. Eleanor was the kind of generous, socially conscious woman who'd spent decades using her wealth for genuine good, funding hospitals and schools and programs that helped working-class families, while Richard viewed philanthropy as tax strategy rather than moral obligation. The tension between Eleanor's values and Richard's greed had existed for years, but Robert Thornton's presence had kept it somewhat contained. Robert had been a genuine partner to Eleanor, sharing her commitment to using their wealth responsibly while also serving as buffer between her and Richard's worst impulses. When Robert passed suddenly from a heart condition in 2022, that buffer disappeared, leaving Eleanor vulnerable to Richard's increasingly aggressive attempts to control her money. Richard had always assumed he'd inherit everything when his parents passed. The mansion, the investment portfolio, the real estate holdings, the art collection, everything. He'd built his entire financial planning around that assumption, living beyond even his substantial hedge fund income because he knew tens of millions were coming eventually. His wife, Patricia, had expensive tastes. His 3 children attended elite private schools. And his lifestyle required the kind of money that even successful hedge fund managers couldn't sustain without inheritance backing them up. Eleanor's diagnosis came in March 2024, delivered by her longtime physician doctor, Sarah Chen, with the kind of gentle but honest clarity that serious medical news requires. Advanced lung condition, spread to other areas, prognosis of 6 to 12 months, even with aggressive treatment. Eleanor was 77 years old, still sharp mentally, but increasingly frail physically, facing the reality that her time was limited and she needed to make decisions about her final months. Richard's reaction to his mother's diagnosis was revealing in its complete lack of empathy. His first question to Dr. Chen was about the timeline. How long did his mother have? How accurate were the estimates? What would happen if they chose minimal intervention to let nature take its course faster? He framed these questions as concern about his mother's quality of life, but Eleanor recognized them for what they really were, calculations about when he could expect his inheritance. Richard, Eleanor had said quietly after the doctor left, "I'm very ill, and your first concern is how quickly it will happen. Don't you think that reveals something troubling about your priorities?" "Mom, I'm just trying to be practical about planning," Richard replied, his voice carrying the impatient tone he used when his mother challenged his behavior. "You're going to need continuous care, medical equipment, possibly hospice services. These things are expensive and complicated, and someone needs to think about logistics instead of just getting emotional." "I have more than enough money to pay for my own care," Eleanor responded. "What I need from my son is compassion and companionship during the hardest time of my life, not logistical planning for my passing." But Richard had never been good at emotional support, and he wasn't about to start learning during his mother's final months. Instead, he focused on what he was good at, managing money and assets, specifically positioning himself to maximize his inheritance while minimizing the amount that would be wasted on his mother's end-of-life care. His first move was trying to convince Eleanor to sell the Beacon Hill mansion and move into a care facility, arguing that maintaining the historic property was wasteful when she'd only be alive a few more months. The real motivation was that selling the house immediately would convert it to liquid assets that Richard could access more easily after her passing. Plus, he'd already identified a buyer willing to pay $12 million for the property. Eleanor refused, explaining that she'd lived in that house for 40 years, that it held memories of her life with Robert, and that she wanted to pass at home surrounded by familiar things rather than in some sterile facility. Richard argued with her for weeks, bringing in real estate agents and financial advisors to pressure her about the economic impracticality of maintaining a mansion for someone in her condition. The second disagreement was over Eleanor's medical care. Richard wanted the most economical option, basic hospice services. That would keep her comfortable but not invest in expensive treatments that might extend her life. His argument was that aggressive treatment would only prolong her discomfort without meaningfully changing the outcome. But Eleanor recognized this as another calculation about inheritance timing. "You want me to pass quickly and cheaply," Eleanor said during one particularly difficult argument about medical expenses. "You're literally counting the days and the dollars, treating my situation as a budget line item in your financial planning." "That's not fair, Mom," Richard protested. "I'm trying to be realistic about your prognosis and make sure we don't waste money on treatments that won't work. The doctors said 6 to 12 months regardless of what we do. So, why spend hundreds of thousands on chemotherapy that will just make you sicker? Because those extra months matter to me, even if they're inconvenient for your inheritance timeline, Eleanor replied with the kind of cold clarity that comes from recognizing your child's true character. And because how I choose to spend my money during my final time on Earth is my decision, not yours. That conversation marked a turning point in Eleanor's understanding of her relationship with Richard. She had always known he was selfish and materialistic, but facing her own mortality had stripped away the illusions and justifications she'd made for his behavior over the years. Her son didn't love her, he loved her money, and he was counting the days until he could inherit it. The realization was devastating, but also clarifying. Eleanor began thinking seriously about her legacy and who deserved to benefit from the wealth she and Robert had accumulated over their lifetimes. Richard would inherit millions regardless of what she did. Robert's trust funds and business interests were already designated for him through separate legal arrangements. But Eleanor's personal fortune, the $83 million in assets that she controlled directly, didn't have to go to someone who viewed her situation as a financial opportunity. That's when Eleanor made the decision that would change everything. She hired Maria Santos as her primary private nurse, choosing her specifically because Maria's warmth and genuine compassion reminded Eleanor of the kind of person she valued, rather than the kind of person Richard had become. Let me pause here for just a moment to catch my breath, because thinking about Eleanor's situation still affects me. At my age, having watched too many elderly people face their final days alone or with children who only cared about inheritance, I gotta say this woman's decision to find someone who'd care for her as a human being rather than an ATM was one of the bravest choices I ever witnessed. She could have just accepted Richard's cold calculation, but instead she chose dignity. Maria Santos was a 43-year-old registered nurse from Manila who'd immigrated to the United States in 2015, leaving behind her own 3 children to work in America and send money home to support her family. She'd spent years working double shifts at Boston hospitals, saving every possible dollar to bring her kids to America, while also supporting her aging parents back in the Philippines. Maria's background was everything Richard would have looked down on if he'd bothered to learn about her. Working-class immigrant, heavily accented English, the kind of person wealthy Bostonians typically ignored except when they needed service workers. But Eleanor saw something in Maria during their initial interview that reminded her of the nurses who'd cared for Robert. During his final days, genuine compassion combined with professional competence. Someone who viewed caregiving as a calling rather than just a job. Why do you want this position? Eleanor had asked during the interview. My son is only offering $85,000 per year for live-in care, which is below market rate for someone with your qualifications. You could make more working hospital shifts. Maria had smiled with the kind of warmth that can't be faked. Mrs. Thornton, I've been taking care of people for 20 years. I've learned that the money matters less than the relationship. You need someone who will see you as a person, not as a patient or a burden. And honestly, after years of hospital shifts with different patients every day, the idea of really getting to know one person and making their final time as comfortable and dignified as possible, that's meaningful work. That answer sealed Eleanor's decision. She hired Maria over Richard's objections. He'd wanted to use a staffing agency that would provide cheaper, more easily replaceable caregivers. And Maria moved into the mansion's guest quarters to begin what would become an intense and meaningful 8-month relationship. From the beginning, Maria treated Eleanor with the kind of respect and genuine affection that Richard had never shown. She learned Eleanor's preferences and routines, anticipated her needs before she had to ask, engaged her in real conversations about life and legacy rather than just managing medical tasks. Maria listened to stories about Eleanor's childhood, her marriage to Robert, her disappointments with Richard, her hopes for how she'd be remembered. You know what makes you different from most caregivers? Eleanor asked one evening while Maria was helping her get comfortable for bed. You talk to me like I'm still a whole person instead of just a condition that needs managing. Maria had smiled, her eyes kind. Mrs. Thornton, you are a whole person. The illness is affecting your body, but it hasn't taken your mind or your spirit or your right to be treated with dignity. My job isn't just keeping you comfortable. It's making sure you feel valued and heard during your final time. Those conversations deepened over months as Eleanor's health deteriorated. Maria learned about Eleanor's philanthropic work, her frustration with how generational wealth often corrupted people's values, her disappointment that Richard had never developed compassion or social consciousness despite all his advantages. Eleanor learned about Maria's struggles as an immigrant, her sacrifice in leaving her children to provide for them, her determination to bring them to America while also caring for her aging parents in the Philippines. The contrast between Maria's selfless dedication to family and Richard's selfish calculation about inheritance wasn't lost on Eleanor. Here was a woman who'd given up years with her own children to support them financially, while Eleanor's son couldn't be bothered to spend quality time with his struggling mother, unless it involved discussing her assets. Richard's hostility toward Maria grew as he recognized that the nurse was developing a genuine relationship with his mother that exposed his own emotional inadequacy. He started trying to undermine Maria's position, complaining to Eleanor about the cost of private nursing care and suggesting they switch to cheaper options from staffing agencies. Mom, we're spending over $7,000 per month on this nurse when we could get adequate care for half that. Richard argued during one of his increasingly rare visits. I know you like her, but this is an unnecessary expense when you have limited time left. We need to be more strategic about resource allocation. Richard, I have $83 million in liquid assets alone, Eleanor replied with exasperation. The idea that spending $7,000 per month on compassionate care during my final time alive is somehow fiscally irresponsible is absurd. The real issue is that Maria makes you uncomfortable because she treats me better than you do. That's not fair, Richard protested. I care about you. I'm just trying to make sure your money isn't being wasted on people who are taking advantage of your vulnerability. Taking advantage? Eleanor's voice hardened. Maria works 16-hour days, caring for my most intimate needs with more grace and compassion than you've shown in your entire adult life. If anyone's taking advantage of me, it's the son who views my terminal situation as an opportunity to minimize costs until he can inherit my estate. Those confrontations became more frequent and more bitter as Eleanor's health declined and Richard's inheritance anxiety increased. He started showing up at the mansion with his wife Patricia, both of them walking through rooms and discussing furniture, artwork, and valuables like they were already planning the estate distribution. My involvement in this family situation started when Richard hired me to work overnight security at the mansion, supposedly to protect his mother's valuable art collection and ensure Maria wasn't taking anything. The real purpose, as I quickly realized, was having someone monitor Maria's activities and report anything Richard could use to justify terminating her and replacing her with cheaper caregivers. Sam, I need you to keep detailed logs of everything that happens overnight, Richard explained during my interview. My mother has valuable items throughout the house, and I want documentation of who accesses what areas and when. If you notice the nurse going into rooms she doesn't need to be in or handling items that aren't related to care, I want to know immediately. The subtext was clear. Richard was hoping to catch Maria doing something inappropriate so he could terminate her and cut costs. But what I observed during my first weeks on the job was the exact opposite of what Richard was hoping for. Maria was professional, dedicated, and incredibly attentive to Eleanor's needs. On nights when Eleanor's discomfort was significant, Maria would sit with her for hours, holding her hand and talking softly to provide distraction. When Eleanor couldn't sleep, Maria would read to her from the classic novels Eleanor loved. When Eleanor felt well enough to reminisce, Maria would listen with genuine interest to stories about Boston society in the 1960s and Eleanor's early married life. What I also observed was Richard's increasingly hostile behavior toward both his mother and her nurse. He'd show up at odd hours intoxicated, complaining about the cost of keeping Eleanor alive and the waste of maintaining the mansion for someone in her condition. He'd criticize Maria's care decisions, question medical expenses, and generally make it clear that he viewed his mother's continued existence as an inconvenience to his inheritance timeline. The breaking point came about 4 months into Maria's employment. During a night when Eleanor's discomfort became so significant that Maria called Dr. Chen for emergency consultation about adjusting medications. Richard showed up at 2 a.m., angry about being contacted about his mother's medical crisis, and unleashed a tirade that exposed his true character completely. "Why are you contacting me about every little medical issue?" Richard yelled at Maria in the hallway outside Eleanor's bedroom. "My mother is very ill. That's the whole point of hospice care. Stop trying to prolong the inevitable with expensive interventions that don't change the outcome." Maria, maintaining her professional composure despite Richard's verbal assault, replied calmly, "Your mother is in significant discomfort, and her current medication isn't controlling it adequately. As her primary caregiver, I have a medical and ethical obligation to ensure she's comfortable. This isn't about prolonging her life, it's about managing her symptoms during the time she has left. Her symptoms are costing me thousands in medical bills." Richard shouted, his voice loud enough that I could hear it clearly from my security station downstairs. "Every day she's alive is another day of nursing fees, medication costs, utility expenses for this massive house. If you actually cared about my mother instead of your paycheck, you'd stop interfering with the natural process." "Mr. Thornton," Maria's voice remained calm but carried steel underneath. "Your mother is a human being who deserves dignity and comfort during her final months, not a budget line item that you're eager to close out. If you can't see that, then you need to examine what kind of person you've become." That confrontation, which I recorded on the mansion's security system, marked the moment when Eleanor made her final decision about her inheritance. The next morning, despite significant discomfort and exhaustion, she called her attorney and requested an immediate meeting to modify her estate documents. I didn't know about Eleanor's document changes at the time, and that information would only come out later during the legal proceedings. What I did know was that Eleanor had asked Maria to document everything Richard said and did during his visits, creating a record of his troubling behavior that could be used for purposes Eleanor didn't fully explain. "Maria?" Eleanor said one afternoon when Richard had just left after another hostile visit. "I want you to start recording your phone conversations with Richard and keeping detailed notes about his behavior during visits. Can you do that discreetly?" "Of course, Mrs. Thornton," Maria replied, clearly concerned about what was driving this request. "But may I ask why? Are you worried about legal issues?" "I'm worried about fairness," Eleanor said simply. "I'm worried that my son has become who values money over humanity, and I want documentation of that character before I pass. Promise me you'll keep these records safe, even after I'm gone." Maria promised, though she didn't fully understand the purpose at the time. She started keeping detailed journals about Richard's visits, recording phone conversations where he complained about care costs or suggested withdrawing treatment, documenting every instance where he prioritized finances over his mother's comfort. Meanwhile, Richard's behavior grew increasingly problematic as his mother's condition worsened, but she stubbornly refused to pass on his preferred timeline. He started pressuring Eleanor to sign new financial documents that would give him power of attorney over her assets, claiming it was necessary for efficient estate management, but really wanting control of her money before she passed. Eleanor refused every attempt, maintaining control of her faculties despite physical deterioration. "Richard, I'm very ill, not incompetent," she'd say whenever he pushed new legal documents. "I'll manage my own affairs until my last breath, and you'll inherit when I'm gone. Not before." The final confrontation, the one that would ultimately cost Richard everything, happened on a September evening when Eleanor had been declining rapidly. She de-stopped treatment after determining that the side effects weren't worth the minimal life extension it might provide, and she was clearly entering her final weeks, if not days. Richard had been drinking before he showed up at the mansion around 8 p.m., his wife Patricia with him, both of them clearly discussing something that had them agitated. I watched on security cameras as they entered the house and immediately started arguing with Maria about Eleanor's current condition and care plan. How much longer is this going to take? Patricia demanded, her voice sharp with impatience. "The doctor said 6 to 12 months back in March, and it's been almost 7 months. How much longer do we have to wait?" Maria's response was professional but firm. Mrs. Thornton is receiving excellent palliative care, and we're keeping her as comfortable as possible during her final time. The exact timeline isn't something anyone can predict with certainty. Well, someone needs to predict it, Patricia shot back, because we have financial planning to do and properties to evaluate. This mansion alone is worth $12 million, and we need to start thinking about whether to sell or renovate before the market shifts. The conversation escalated from there, with Richard joining in to complain about the ongoing costs of his mother there and the waste of maintaining staff and services for someone who'd pass soon anyway. Their voices grew louder, clearly audible in Eleanor's bedroom where she was resting. That's when Eleanor called for Maria on the intercom system, her voice weak but determined. Maria, could you please ask my son and his wife to come upstairs? I'd like to speak with them. The confrontation that followed was captured on both security cameras and Maria's phone recording, creating comprehensive documentation of exactly what kind of people Richard and Patricia had become. Eleanor, propped up in her bed with oxygen equipment and looking frail but mentally sharp, addressed her son with devastating clarity. Richard, I heard everything you and Patricia just said to Maria, Eleanor began, her voice stronger than her physical appearance suggested. And I want you to understand something important before I pass. You're not just counting my money, you're recounting the days until I am gone so you can inherit it. That tells me everything I need to know about who you become. Mom, that's not. Richard started to protest, but Eleanor cut him off. Don't be dishonest during my final days. I've watched you for months now, calculating costs and timelines, treating my terminal situation as a financial inconvenience rather than a human difficulty. You've shown more concern about the expense of my care than about my comfort or dignity. And now you're here discussing my property like I'm already gone. We're just trying to be practical about planning, Patricia began, but Eleanor's glare silenced her. You're not family, Eleanor said to Patricia. He married into money, and you're making sure Richard stays focused on maximizing his inheritance rather than spending meaningful time with his struggling mother. You're encouraging his worst impulses, and I want you to know that I recognize exactly what you are. The room fell silent, except for the hum of medical equipment. Richard's face had gone red. Whether from alcohol or anger or embarrassment wasn't clear. Patricia looked like she wanted to say something, but couldn't figure out what wouldn't make things worse. Leave this house, Eleanor said, quietly. Both of you. I don't want to see you again unless you can visit as my son rather than as my heir. And if you can't make that distinction, then stay away and let me pass in peace with people who actually care about me as a human being. Richard's response revealed exactly why Eleanor had made the decision she'd made about her estate. Instead of apologizing or showing any remorse, he exploded with rage that exposed the entitlement and greed that had been building for months. You ungrateful woman, Richard yelled, his voice carrying throughout the mansion. I put up with your demands and your judgment, and your attitude about money for my entire life. You've always acted like being wealthy came with some moral obligation to give it all away to charity instead of passing it to your own family. Your family has plenty, Eleanor replied calmly. Your father's trusts and business interests will provide more than enough for you to live comfortably. What I'm not going to do is reward the kind of behavior. You reshowing me right now by leaving you additional millions that you have earned through anything, except being born to wealthy parents. You can't do this. Richard's rage was completely uncontrolled now. That money is my inheritance. I'm your son. You can't just give away my money to charity, or, he turned to glare at Maria, or to some immigrant nurse who's probably manipulating you into changing your documents. Maria hasn't manipulated anyone, Eleanor said firmly. She's shown me more genuine compassion in the past months than you've this decade. And my estate planning is my business, not yours. You'll find out what I've decided after I'm gone, and not before. What happened next was captured in concerning detail on multiple cameras and Maria's phone recording. Richard, intoxicated and enraged beyond any remaining self-control, grabbed his mother by her shoulders and started yelling directly into her face. You're going to pass and going to inherit everything, whether you like it or not. You can't take it with you, and I'm your only heir. So stop playing these games about morality and family values and accept that your money is going to me. Maria immediately intervened, physically positioning herself between Richard and Eleanor while activating the emergency call button that would summon Dr. Chen and alert me to come upstairs. Richard pushed Maria aside, continuing his tirade while Patricia stood frozen, clearly horrified by her husband's complete meltdown but too shocked to intervene. Leave this house immediately before I contact authorities. Richard yelled, completely losing touch with reality in his rage. You're terminally ill anyway, so why don't you receive care somewhere that isn't depleting my resources? I arrived as Richard was physically trying to force Eleanor from her own bed, his hands on her frail shoulders while she gasped for breath, and Maria fought to protect her patient from her patient. As own son. I pulled Richard away while calling emergency services for both law enforcement and medical assistance. Remove your hands from me. Richard yelled, turning his rage toward me. This is my mother's house, and I'm her son, and I can do whatever I want here. This is physical harm and elder mistreatment, I replied, maintaining my grip on Richard while positioning my body between him and Eleanor. And everything that just happened is recorded on multiple cameras and audio devices. You just physically harmed your struggling mother while making threats. You're finished here. Law enforcement arrived within minutes. This was Beacon Hill, where emergency response times for wealthy addresses are remarkably fast. Richard was detained for physical harm and elder mistreatment. Patricia was questioned as a witness. And Eleanor was examined by paramedics who confirmed she'd been physically harmed during Richard's actions. Eleanor spent the next 3 days in the hospital recovering from bruised ribs and elevated stress that had triggered complications with her condition. Richard was released on bail, but a protective order prevented him from contacting Eleanor or entering her property. The incident became a minor news story in Boston society. Page's hedge fund manager detained for harming struggling mother, generating gossip among the social circles where the Thornton family name still carried weight. What nobody outside Eleanor's legal team knew was that she'd already modified her documents 2 weeks earlier. Before Richard's physical harm, the incident simply confirmed the wisdom of decisions she'd already made about her estate and her legacy. Eleanor passed 6 weeks later, on October 31st, 2024, in her bedroom at the Beacon Hill mansion with Maria holding her hand and me standing security in the hallway. Her passing was peaceful despite the physical challenges of her condition, surrounded by the dignity and compassion that Maria had provided throughout her final months. Richard wasn't present, wasn't informed until after his mother had passed, and wasn't welcome at the small memorial service Eleanor had planned with her attorney and closest friends. The protective order had kept him away during her final weeks, meaning he never got the chance to apologize or reconcile. Not that Eleanor believed any apology would have been genuine, rather than strategically motivated by inheritance concerns. The document reading happened 1 week after the memorial, in the oak-paneled offices of Eleanor's attorney, James Patterson, on Boylston Street. Richard attended with Patricia and his own lawyer, clearly expecting to hear that he de-inherited the $83 million estate, despite the recent difficulties with his mother. The protective order had expired with Eleanor's passing, so legally there was nothing preventing his attendance. Maria was also present, invited by attorney Patterson for reasons Richard initially interpreted as some minor bequest, maybe $50,000 or $100,000, as a thank you for nursing services. He was actually pleased that Maria was there, figuring it would be satisfying to watch her receive a small fraction of the wealth he was about to inherit. James Patterson began reading the documents with formal precision, laying out Eleanor's assets in detail. The Beacon Hill mansion valued at $12 million. Investment portfolios worth $54 million. Real estate holdings worth $11 million. Artwork and personal property worth $6 million. Totaling $83 million in Eleanor's personal estate that she decontrolled independently of Robert as separate trusts. Richard listened with barely concealed satisfaction, calculating the wealth he was about to receive. His hedge fund had been struggling lately, and the timing of this inheritance could and have been better for shoring up his financial position and lifestyle. Then Patterson reached the distribution section of the documents, and the room's atmosphere changed completely. I don't care about the odds. Richard shot back. I'll spend whatever it takes to prove that this nurse manipulated a vulnerable woman into taking my inheritance. Maria Santos came to this country as an immigrant looking for opportunities. And she found a wealthy elderly lady she could trick into changing her documents. Maria finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm despite her tears. Mr. Thornton, I never asked your mother for anything except the chance to care for her with dignity. I didn't know about the document changes until today. Your mother made her decision based on how you treated her versus how I treated her. And deep down, that's true, even if you'll never admit it. Be quiet, Richard responded sharply, pointing at Maria with real venom. You're someone who took advantage of my family, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. I'm going to challenge your nursing license, your immigration status, your reputation, everything. You're going to regret the day you decided to target my mother. Mr. Thornton, I interjected, stepping forward from where I'd been standing near the door. You might want to reconsider those threats. I have months of security footage showing exactly how you treated your mother and exactly how Maria treated her. If you want to make this a public confrontation about character and who deserved Eleanor's trust, I don't think the comparison is going to work out the way you're hoping. Richard turned his anger toward me. You just the security guard who took sides with an immigrant nurse, against a family you had no business interfering with. I'll have your employment terminated, your reputation damaged, and I'll take legal action against you personally for an invasion of privacy and whatever else my lawyers can come up with. Those security cameras were installed at your request, I reminded him calmly. You specifically asked me to monitor Maria's activities and report anything inappropriate. What I reported was your behavior, not hers. And everything I recorded was in performance of the security duties you assigned me. So threaten all you want, but you're the one who created the evidence that destroyed your inheritance. The meeting dissolved into further threats and recriminations before Patterson finally ended it, explaining that Richard had 30 days to file a formal contest if he chose to pursue that route. Richard stormed out with Patricia, already on his phone calling lawyers and beginning what would become a long, expensive, and ultimately unsuccessful legal battle. Maria remained behind, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. She'd gone from being a nurse earning $85,000 per year to inheriting $83 million, a sum so large she couldn't even process what it meant for her life and her family. I don't understand, Maria said to Patterson after Richard left. Why would Mrs. Thornton do this? I was just doing my job, taking care of a patient who needed help. I never expected or wanted anything like this. That's exactly why she did it, Patterson explained gently. Eleanor spent her entire life around people who wanted her money, her son, her social circle, countless charity seekers, and business associates. You were the first person in years who cared about her as a human being rather than as a source of wealth. That mattered to her more than blood relations or family obligation. But $83 million, Maria whispered, still trying to comprehend the number. That's more money than I could earn in 10 lifetimes. I have 3 children in the Philippines I'm trying to bring to America. I send money home to support my parents. This amount of money will change everything for my entire family. That's what Eleanor wanted. Patterson said she wanted her wealth to go to someone who would use it to build opportunities and support family, the way she and her husband Robert had done with their own fortune. She believed you de-honor the responsibility that comes with this kind of wealth better than Richard ever would. Over the following weeks, Maria worked with Patterson and financial advisors to understand the estate she inherited and make decisions about managing it responsibly. The Beacon Hill mansion became hers, though she initially felt uncomfortable living in such luxury when she did spend her entire life in working-class housing. The investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and other assets came with professional management teams who'd help her navigate the complexity of sudden wealth. But Maria's first priority was fulfilling the dreams that had driven her to immigrate to America in the first place, bringing her children to Boston and reuniting her family after years of painful separation. Within 3 months, her 3 children, ages 12, 15, and 17 were living with her in the mansion, enrolled in excellent private schools, and experiencing opportunities their mother had sacrificed everything to provide. Maria also brought her elderly parents from the Philippines, giving them comfortable retirement in the guest quarters where Maria herself had lived while caring for Eleanor. The irony wasn't lost on her. The immigrant nurse, who cared for a passing American woman, was now able to provide the same kind of dignified care for her own aging parents. Richard's document contest became a spectacle that played out in Massachusetts. Probate court over 8 months of bitter litigation. He hired expensive lawyers who argued that Eleanor had been mentally incompetent, that Maria had exercised undue influence over a vulnerable patient, and that the documents violated public policy by disinheriting a biological child in favor of a paid caregiver. But the evidence supporting Eleanor's decision was overwhelming and comprehensive. Dr. Chun testified about Eleanor's complete mental competency throughout the document-changing process. 3 independent psychiatric evaluators confirmed that Eleanor had been of sound mind and clear intention. The security footage and audio recordings showed Richard's troubling behavior in devastating detail. Most powerfully, Eleanor Dess' own video statement articulated her reasoning with such clarity and specificity that no jury could reasonably conclude she'd been manipulated or confused. She explicitly addressed the decision to disinherit Richard, explaining exactly what behavior had led to that choice and why Maria deserved the inheritance net. The trial became a media sensation, with coverage focusing on the contrast between Richard's entitled greed and Maria's humble compassion. Public opinion strongly favored Maria, with social media filled with comments praising Eleanor's decision to reward genuine care over blood relation. Veterans groups and immigrant advocacy organizations rallied around Maria's case, seeing it as validation that character and compassion mattered more than family connections. Richard's reputation was destroyed by the trial. The security footage of him yelling at his struggling mother about medical costs went viral, generating universal condemnation. Video of him physically harming Eleanor made him a symbol of elder mistreatment and entitled wealthy cruelty. His hedge fund lost clients who didn't want to be associated with someone who detreated his own mother so terribly. Patricia filed for separation midway through the trial, clearly recognizing that Richard's behavior had destroyed his social standing and financial prospects. The separation settlement was difficult, with Patricia walking away with significant assets from Richard's inheritance from his father's estate and custody of their 3 children, who wanted minimal contact with their father after learning how he treated their grandmother. The probate court's final ruling took less than 2 hours of deliberation. The judge found that Eleanor had been completely competent, that there was no evidence of undue influence by Maria, and that Eleanor's decision to disinherit Richard was fully supported by documented evidence of his behavior. The documents were validated in their entirety, with Maria confirmed as the sole beneficiary of Eleanor's $83 million estate. This case represents a clear example of testamentary freedom, the judge stated in her ruling. Eleanor Thornton had every legal right to leave her estate to whomever she chose, and her reasoning rewarding compassionate care over entitled expectation is both legally sound and morally defensible. The evidence shows that Miss Santos earned this inheritance through genuine human decency, while Mr. Thornton forfeited it through documented cruelty toward his struggling mother. Richard's appeal was rejected at every level, eventually reaching the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, which declined to hear the case. After spending over $2 million in legal fees and destroying his reputation in the process, Richard had nothing to show for his efforts except confirmation that his mother's final judgment had been accurate. The financial and social consequences for Richard were catastrophic and permanent. His hedge fund collapsed after losing most of its clients, forcing him to close the business and lay off his entire staff. His separation cost him millions from his father's inheritance and left him with minimal custody of children who'd grown to avoid him. His social standing in Boston evaporated as former friends, and associates distanced themselves from the man who'd become a symbol of elder mistreatment and filial cruelty. He ended up moving to a modest condominium in a suburban area, working as a financial consultant for a firm that didn't know or care about his family history, living a middle-class existence that would have been unimaginable when he'd expected to inherit tens of millions. The irony was that his obsessive focus on inheriting his mother's wealth had cost him everything. His marriage, his business, his reputation, his relationship with his children, and ultimately the inheritance itself. Maria, meanwhile, used Eleanor's fortune in ways that honored the values Eleanor had cherished. She established the Eleanor Thornton Foundation, which provided scholarships for immigrant students pursuing nursing degrees, funded hospice care for low-income families, and supported programs that trained caregivers to work with terminal patients with compassion and dignity. She continued working as a nurse despite her wealth, believing that Eleanor's legacy deserved more than just financial management. It deserved continued commitment to the caregiving profession that had brought them together. Maria worked part-time at a Boston hospice facility, donating her salary back to the institution while providing the same compassionate care that had impressed Eleanor. Her children thrived in their new opportunities, excelling in school and developing the same strong work ethic and compassion that their mother had modeled. The oldest son attended Harvard on academic scholarship despite not needing financial aid, determined to earn his success rather than relying on inherited wealth. The daughter became a volunteer at the same hospice where her mother worked, inspired by the story of how compassion had transformed their family's life. Maria's parents lived comfortably in the mansion's guest quarters, receiving the kind of dignified care in their old age that Maria had once provided to Eleanor. The parallel wasn't lost on Maria. She was able to honor her own parents the way she de-honored Eleanor. Completing the circle of compassionate caregiving that had defined her life's work, the Beacon Hill Mansion, once the site of Richard's cruelty and Eleanor's struggle, became a gathering place for Maria's extended family and a symbol of how immigrant dreams could be realized through dedication and character. Maria kept Eleanor's personal items and photographs throughout the house, ensuring that the woman who'd changed her life would always be remembered and honored. 5 years after Eleanor's passing, Maria organized a memorial service at the mansion, inviting everyone who'd known Eleanor and witnessed the final chapter of her life. I attended, of course, having played my role in documenting the truth that ultimately validated Eleanor's final wishes. During the memorial, Maria spoke about what Eleanor's trust had meant to her family and how she was trying to honor that legacy every day. Mrs. Thornton taught me that wealth is a responsibility, not just a privilege, Maria said to the gathered crowd. She showed me that how you treat people when they're vulnerable reveals everything about your character. And she proved that family is defined by love and care, not by blood relation. I think about her every day, Maria continued, her voice thick with emotion. I think about how she chose to spend her final months surrounded by dignity instead of cruelty, how she used her wealth to reward compassion instead of entitlement, how she proved that doing the right thing matters more than maintaining family appearances. I hope I can live up to the trust she placed in me. Richard was not present at the memorial, hadn't been invited, and probably wouldn't have attended even if he had been. By that point, he'd become a bitter, isolated figure who blamed everyone except himself for the consequences of his own behavior. He occasionally gave interviews to tabloid publications claiming his mother had been manipulated and his inheritance had been taken. But nobody took these claims seriously after the comprehensive court record documenting his mistreatment. His children had grown up and wanted minimal contact with him, having built relationships with Maria and her family instead. They'd come to understand their grandmother, Eleanor, through Maria's stories and Eleanor's own journals. Recognizing the wisdom in her final decisions about her estate, they called Maria Tita Filipino for aunt and spent holidays at the Beacon Hill Mansion with Maria's family rather than with their estranged father. The broader impact of Eleanor's documents and the subsequent legal battle extended far beyond one family drama. The case became a landmark example in a state, planning circles of how to structure bequests that reward character over blood relation, while protecting against successful contests. Law schools taught the case to demonstrate testamentary freedom and the importance of documenting reasoning behind controversial inheritance decisions. Elder care advocates used Eleanor and Maria's story to highlight the importance of compassionate end-of-life care and the need to protect vulnerable seniors from financially motivated mistreatment by family members. The contrast between Richard's calculated neglect and Maria's genuine compassion became a teaching tool for what ethical caregiving should look like. Immigrant advocacy groups celebrated Maria's inheritance as validation that the American dream still existed for those willing to work hard and maintain their values despite hardship. Maria became a spokesperson for immigrant nurses and caregivers, using her platform to advocate for better wages, working conditions, and legal protections for the millions of immigrant women doing caregiving work throughout the United States. The Eleanor Thornton Foundation that Maria established grew into a major philanthropic force in New England, eventually distributing over $30 million in scholarships, grants, and program funding. The foundation, supporting compassionate caregiving and immigrant education, directly reflected the values that had brought Eleanor and Maria together during those final months. As I reflect on this case years later, I am struck by how Eleanor's decision to reward compassion over blood relation created ripples that extended far beyond her own family. Her final act of agency, choosing who deserved her wealth based on character, rather than genetics, validated something important about what family really means and what inheritance should reward. The investigation reminded me that the most important relationships aren't always the ones defined by blood or law, but by genuine care during times of vulnerability. Maria earned Eleanor's trust and inheritance through months of compassionate service, while Richard forfeited his birthright through months of calculated cruelty. The legal system validated Eleanor's judgment, and history proved her wisdom. So, what do you think about inheritance and whether adult children automatically deserve their parents' wealth regardless of how they treat them? Have you witnessed families torn apart by inheritance disputes or seen situations where caregivers showed more love than biological children? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, Tell me what city you're watching from and share any experiences you've had with family greed, elder mistreatment, or the kind of compassionate caregiving that Maria provided. But before you go, I need to tell you about Uncle Sam's next investigation, because it involves something that will show you how assumptions about education and class can backfire spectacularly. Picture this. A wealthy customer who regularly mocked what he thought was an uneducated auto mechanic for his dirty hands and working class job, not knowing that the humble mechanic actually owned 15 auto shops throughout Texas worth over $40 million. And was about to teach this entitled customer the most expensive lesson about judging people by their appearance, right? Make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. Because Uncle Sam's next story exposes, I watched rich customer mock uneducated mechanic. He owned 15 auto shops worth millions. The lesson from Eleanor, Richard, and Maria's story remains crystal clear. Inheritance should reward character and compassion, not just genetic connection. And how you treat vulnerable people reveals everything about whether you deserve their trust and their legacy. Because sometimes the immigrant nurse caring for your struggling parent deserves your inheritance more than you do. And sometimes the consequences of elder mistreatment include losing everything you thought you were entitled to, bro. And sometimes it takes an old security guard documenting the truth to make sure that justice prevails over blood relation. That compassion defeats entitlement. And that final wishes are honored even when greedy children try to overturn them in court. 10 years after Eleanor's passing, the story of her inheritance decision continued to influence lives and shape conversations about family, wealth, and what we owe each other as human beings. The Thornton case had become more than just a legal precedent. It had become a cultural touchstone for discussions about earned versus inherited privilege, the value of caregiving work, and the responsibilities that come with generational wealth. Maria's children had all graduated from college by this point, each of them choosing careers in service professions that reflected their mother's values. The oldest, Miguel, had become a physician specializing in palliative care, working with terminal patients the way his mother had worked with Eleanor. The middle child, Sophia, had gone into social work, focusing on supporting immigrant families navigating the American healthcare system. The youngest, Carlos, was studying nursing at Boston University, planning to continue the caregiving tradition that had transformed his family's life. The Eleanor Thornton Foundation had grown beyond Maria's initial vision, now funding programs throughout New England and beyond. Scholarship recipients, many of them immigrants pursuing nursing degrees like Maria once had, numbered in the hundreds. Hospice facilities that received foundation grants provided compassionate, end-of-life care to thousands of patients whose families couldn't afford private nursing services. But perhaps the foundation's most impactful program was the one Maria had created specifically to address the kind of elder mistreatment that Richard had inflicted on Eleanor. The Dignity in Final Days initiative trained professional caregivers to recognize and report signs of financial exploitation and mistreatment by family members, while also providing legal support for seniors who wanted to protect themselves from predatory relatives. The program had already helped dozens of elderly people escape situations where adult children or other family members were pressuring them about inheritance, isolating them from support systems, or actively mistreating them while waiting for them to pass. Each case reminded Maria of Eleanor's courage in standing up to Richard's cruelty and making choices that honored her own values rather than family obligation. Richard's life, by contrast, had continued its downward trajectory. His second marriage had ended in separation after 5 years. His consulting career had stalled at a mediocre level, and his relationships with his adult children remained estranged and hostile. He developed health problems, high blood pressure, early-stage diabetes, stress-related conditions that seemed to physically manifest the bitterness and resentment he carried. The sad thing about Richard, Maria said when asked about him during a foundation event, is that he never understood what he actually lost. He focuses on the money, $83 million that he thinks was taken from him. But what he really lost was the opportunity to have a meaningful relationship with his mother during her final months. The chance to show her that he valued her as a person rather than as an inheritance source. If Richard had treated Mrs. Thornton with even basic compassion, Maria continued, she probably would have left him substantial wealth, despite his flaws. She wasn't trying to punish him when she changed her documents. She was trying to reward the kind of behavior she valued and hoping he might learn something about character. But he was too focused on money to understand the lesson. The annual Eleanor Thornton Memorial Lecture, held at Boston University's School of Nursing, had become a prestigious event where leading voices in healthcare, elder care, and immigrant rights discussed the intersection of compassion and professional caregiving. Maria delivered the keynote speech at the 10th anniversary lecture, reflecting on a decade of living with the responsibility Eleanor had entrusted to her. When Mrs. Thornton left me her estate, Maria told the audience of nursing students, caregivers, and medical professionals, she wasn't just giving me money. She was giving me a mission to prove that wealth could be earned through compassion rather than inheritance. That caregiving work deserved to be valued and rewarded. That character mattered more than blood relation. I think about that responsibility every single day. Every scholarship we award, every hospice we support, every caregiver we train. These are all reflections of Mrs. Thornton's belief that money should serve human dignity rather than just accumulating for its own sake. And every time we help someone escape elder mistreatment or financial exploitation, we're honoring her courage in standing up to her own son's cruelty. The speech was interrupted multiple times by applause, with many in the audience moved to tears by Maria's gratitude and her commitment to honoring Eleanor's legacy. Nursing students approached Maria afterward, inspired by the story of how compassionate caregiving could transform lives and create opportunities that traditional career paths might never provide. One student, a young woman from Guatemala working her way through nursing school while supporting her family back home, asked Maria the question that many were thinking. Do you ever feel guilty about inheriting so much money when Mrs. Thornton's biological son received nothing? Maria considered the question carefully before responding. I felt guilty at first. Absolutely. I kept thinking about how Richard was her son, how blood relations should mean something, how maybe I didn't deserve this kind of life-changing fortune. But then I remembered something Mrs. Thornton said to me a few weeks before she passed. She told me that she'd given Richard every advantage: elite education, family connections, inherited wealth from his father, opportunities that most people never get. She'd given him everything except one thing: a good character. And that was something he had to develop himself, which he never did. She said her inheritance to me wasn't about punishing Richard. It was about rewarding the kind of person she wished he'd become. So, no. Maria concluded, I don't feel guilty. I feel responsible. I feel accountable to Mrs. Thornton's trust and her values. I feel obligated to use this wealth in ways that honor her memory and help people the way she wanted to help people. But guilt? No. I earned this inheritance through care and compassion. And I am going to keep earning it every day by living up to the responsibility that comes with it. As the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's passing approached, Maria began planning a major expansion of the Foundation's work, establishing an endowment that would ensure its programs could continue in perpetuity. The endowment would be funded with $40 million from Eleanor's estate, money that had grown substantially under professional management, creating a permanent tribute to the woman who de-transformed Maria's life through an act of trust and recognition. Mrs. Thornton believed that wealth should serve human dignity and create opportunities for people who deep and systematically denied them, Maria explained during the endowment announcement. This permanent fund ensures that her values will continue influencing lives long after I'm gone, that her choice to reward compassion over blood relation will keep creating positive effects for generations to come. The announcement generated substantial media coverage, with reporters noting that Maria was giving away nearly half of her remaining inheritance to ensure Eleanor's legacy would continue in perpetuity. Financial analysts questioned whether such generosity was wise, suggesting that Maria should retain more wealth for her own security and her children's futures. But Maria's response captured exactly why Eleanor had chosen her as the inheritance recipient. My children don't need tens of millions of dollars to live meaningful lives. They need education, opportunities, and the values that help them use whatever resources they have to benefit others. Mrs. Thornton gave me far more money than I personally needed. And using that excess to help people aligns perfectly with why she gave it to me in the first place. Besides, Maria added with a smile, I still have $43 million even after establishing this endowment. That's more than enough for my family's security and comfort. The rest should circulate through communities and create the kind of opportunities that Mrs. Thornton valued. That's not sacrifice. It's responsibility. As I watched this story continue to unfold over 15 years, I remained struck by how one woman, a decision at the end of her life, had created such lasting impact. Eleanor could have chosen the path of least resistance, leaving her estate to Richard despite his cruelty, maintaining family appearances, avoiding the conflict and controversy that came with disinheriting her only child. But she'd chosen truth over convenience, character over genetics, and earned compassion over entitled expectation. That choice had transformed Maria's life, created opportunities for hundreds of scholarship recipients, funded compassionate care for thousands of patients, and demonstrated that family is defined by love rather than by blood relation. The lesson remained as relevant as ever. What we do with our resources reveals our true values. How we treat vulnerable people shows our genuine character. And the families we choose through compassion often deserve our trust more than the families we're reborn into through genetic accident. Eleanor Thornton had understood those truths at the end of her life. And her final act of agency had created a legacy that would outlast her son's bitterness. Maria's lifetime, and probably my own remaining years. That's what genuine wealth looks like, not just numbers in bank accounts, but values that propagate through generations and transform lives in ways that compound over time, So, as I reflect on this case in my later years, still working security jobs, more out of habit than necessity at this point, I'm reminded why I've spent my career documenting the truth even when it made powerful people uncomfortable. Because sometimes the truth is all that stands between justice and injustice, between earned inheritance and entitled expectation. between genuine compassion and cruel calculation, bro. And sometimes an old security guard's footage is what makes the difference between a struggling woman just wishes being honored and a greedy son getting away with elder mistreatment while inheriting millions he never deserved. That's the power of documentation, the importance of standing up for what's right, and the satisfaction that comes from knowing you helped ensure that compassion defeated entitlement. That character triumphed over genetics, and that one brave woman's final wishes were honored exactly as she intended.